Okay, why don't we get going? So a very warm welcome to you all to this international roundtable on demanding power. Can citizens hold governments to account over energy? My name is Newell. I'm a director of the policy practice and associate fellow at the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex. And my particular passion and interest is in understanding the political economy of the energy sector in the global south. And so I'm delighted to be your chair for today's roundtable. There's huge international attention about the energy transition from fossil fuel to clean energy. And yet over the last few years, we've also seen a large number of riots and protests about energy issues in dozens of countries around the world, from Sudan to Lebanon to France, Pakistan, Ecuador, the list goes on and on. And citizens have been demanding their rights to access affordable energy, whether clean or otherwise. This roundtable asks the simple question, can citizens hold governments to account over energy? Do these protests actually achieve empowerment? Do they obtain accountability? And if not, what should be done about it? These questions have been part of a research project called Demanding Power under the auspices of the FCDO-funded Action for Empowerment and Accountability research program. And to talk briefly about the program, we're going to kick off with some comments by Marjoke Oostrom about the A4EA program. So Marjoke, over to you.
Although, John, are you?
I'm here and I can step in.
Oh, great, John, excellent, you're with us. So please do step in, John.
Great, apologies, colleagues, I had a little delay. Yes, I'm director of the A4EA program here at IDS. And Naomi, if somebody running the slides, if we can go to the next one. We are an FCDO supported program, which over the last 5 years has been asking this question. How and under what conditions does social and political action contribute to empowerment and accountability, particularly in settings with history of conflict, violence, and fragility? The program has studied done a variety of projects in 5 countries, Mozambique, Myanmar, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Egypt. And we have over 150 now research and policy and non-academic projects and products on our website. Next slide, please. In the last couple of years, we've been focusing on a series of themes. The one we're here talking about today is number 3 on this list, called Demanding Power, the Politics of Energy Access, and that's our focus in Mozambique, Nigeria, and Pakistan. But we've also done work and have been holding seminar webinars around women's leadership and political participation, navigating civic space under COVID, how donors work in these kinds of settings, and governance at the margins, which is exploring marginalized groups' engagements with public authorities and how they engage with those authorities. All of this information, next slide please, is on our website, and we hope that if you're interested, you will sign up at our newsletter or go to the website. But as you can see, we have in this slide a number of our partners, and I just want to say thanks to everyone here for attending today. But also thanks, this has genuinely been a partnership-based project as well as program. So a big thanks to Naomi Hussein, our lead researcher, who is now based with the Accountability Research Center in Washington, with colleagues, and I won't name them all, apologies, from LUMS and IDEA in Pakistan, from PASCAR, the University of Ibadan in Osun State in Nigeria, from Kaleidoscopio in Mozambique, from the Angela Ruskin University here in the UK. And thanks very much to Neil McCullough from the policy practice for putting this webinar together and being a kind of energy advisor and partner throughout the program. So it's been a terrific team. We think this is an important piece of work, but we are really delighted to engage with you to get your thoughts about what it means for policy and particularly for how to engage citizens for greater accountability in energy policy. Neil, back to you.
Thanks so much, John. And if you're interested in some of the outputs of the research program, you'll see the papers have been put in the chat. So you can click on those links and see access to the papers. Now, discuss these issues, I'm delighted that we have the lead researcher for the Demanding Power program with us, which is Naomi Hussain. We're going to have a 10-minute presentation from Naomi, and after that we've got some superb panelists to discuss the implications of this research, who I'll introduce as we go along. If you have comments on the work, or you want to make comments as you go along, please do put them in the chat. If you have questions you would like to ask Naomi, you'll see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, so just click on that and put some questions in the Q&A. Naomi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Neil. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. There's so much going on. I'm really delighted that so many people, of the white people, in fact, as you were all invited, and that's the only reason you're here, have come to talk to us about what we think is a really crucial issue of the popular politics of energy. And as John already said, I am basically the person who put the cake in the oven, and these are the people who made the ingredients, grew the ingredients, put them all together. So it's a very large team that made this particular cake. If you hate the research, of course, it'll be my fault. But actually, if you like it, there's a really lot of us who have been involved in this in various different ways. And I should say in particular to Neil, who brings an energy policy perspective to our rather more political sociological agenda. None of us, with the exception, I think, of John Agbonifo, would classify ourselves as energy experts. So, we approach this very much from a different perspective. So please keep that in mind and be, speak to us as though we don't understand energy, which is the case. We're learning a lot, of course. So there is the major motivations for this research really were quite inductive, actually. We started off trying to find out, under the auspices of the A4EA program, what kinds of political action were really prominent in fragile and conflict-affected settings. We were looking at Egypt, Myanmar, Pakistan, Nigeria, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe in the first part of the 21st century. And it turned out that all of the really big moments when citizens came together, when there was mass kind of contention and people engaging with their governments in various different ways, they were almost all triggered by, in different ways, energy, mostly fuel prices, but other kinds of energy as well. Electricity was also important. And as you see from these pictures, the last couple of years since 2019, and including in the COVID year of 2020, there have been a huge number of protests around the world that were triggered in different ways by energy prices and energy shortages and people's complaints about those. We see that they have become very frequent all around the world, and the ACLED database has started, or maybe they always did, but they have been collecting data on this, and it shows a large number of such events, larger than you would think. But they also occur in all political regimes types, at all levels of development. Here you have, for example, the Sudanese revolution, the French Gilets Jaunes movement, the Chilean, Ecuadorian, and Iranian protests all in 2019. So a huge range of different political settings, different types of energy regimes, different levels of development and geography. These have all been quite politically significant. And this, I think, is really important, that I'll say some more about in a bit, how they're politically significant. But also there's a very limited research actually on this. And Davide Natalini, one of our team, actually wrote his PhD on food and fuel riots. And he was impressed by how limited the published evidence on fuel price protests has been, particularly compared to food price protests of a similar nature. And our agenda here really very much was to try to research these issues from the ground up, to listen to what citizens and protesters were saying, because we felt that this was a particular gap in the policy world, in the development policy world, I should say in particular. So Davide and Neil took one part of our research involved analysis of fuel riots, i.e. protests specifically about prices of petrol at the pump. And there were many of these in 2021. And we think these are only going to become more important over time for reasons we'll explain in a bit. So these were the research questions that we approached these issues with. Essentially, do protests work in the sense that they make citizens more powerful vis-a-vis energy policy, and they enable them with that new power to hold authorities accountable for shortfalls in energy supply, for shortages, for price rises, price hikes, inadequacies, lack of provision, and so on. We did this building on other research that we've done in the past, including on food riots. We did this through multi-sited case studies. It's very mixed method research with some quantitative and some qualitative research. And I think one of our good innovations here that our teams in Nigeria, Pakistan, and Mozambique did particularly well was cultural and social media analysis. So you see this meme, it's a bit fuzzy, stolen from Facebook or something, no doubt, but you can see the comedy with which, the humor with which people express their discontent about energy policies. This one was from Nigeria. And Neil Davide and with Patricia Justino did an analysis of these fuel rights, which I already mentioned. So we tried very hard to triangulate our qualitative and quantitative research findings. And I'm going to give you such a high level analysis of what we found here. I do apologize for the high level. Please read the executive summary of the synthesis paper if you think I've been too summary. These protests are significant political events, and I think this is important because, in particular, in the multilateral agencies, there does tend to be a sense in which these are unfortunate parts of the subsidy reform agenda, something that you have to go through, and we say instead, no, actually energy protests are often very violent, often very disruptive. They often lead to quite significant shifts in political power. And sometimes they escalate into far larger uprisings, and they link unpopular energy policies with corruption and ultimately with bad governance, signaling that political and economic elites are in collusion. The second really key finding is that energy is necessary, increasingly necessary for daily life. Affordable kinds of modern energy are absolutely essential for basic livelihoods and so on. So it's not that surprising that we find that people everywhere have, in different ways, but a sense of energy as a right. Access to affordable energy, whether it's electricity or transport fuel or even transport fares, these things are not really negotiable. These are absolutes that citizens must have. And the final really key finding, I think, is that we don't really see that these protests, and I know there are people on this call who will disagree with this argument in relation to specific countries, that there was some change in how citizens engage with energy policy. There was some empowerment, there was some accountability, but overall we see no really strong signs that citizens have built stronger organizational capacities or policy space for energy. And we don't find that governments or private sector energy providers have created more space for them to be heard. And we say really that what this comes down to is that energy security is emerging as what we call a wicked problem, in that on the one hand, demands for energy are going to rise. People's expectations of energy are also very likely, we think, to rise. But you end up with this self-reinforcing cycle in which energy policy tends to be quite secretive. Prices change and supplies change without any involvement of the public. These create fiscal strain, further price hikes, further protests, further mistrust. So it seems that policymakers, whether international or national, are locked into this vicious cycle of responding to or fearing protests while not actually being able to do anything to make citizens happier about energy reforms. And this is partly to do with the fact that, again, the World Bank and the IMF often propose, and the bilateral donors often propose, that governments should replace subsidies which are poorly targeted and unsustainable and so on, and inequitable, should replace them with social protection schemes and programs. But most of these governments have shown no sign of being able to do this in the past. And most citizens find this, frankly, an incredible prospect and prefer to hold on to the subsidies if they can. As they say, this is the only thing we get from our wealth. For us, it's clear that these are institutional failures going on here. These are deep-seated institutional failures from the very bottom, from the very top of the system to the very bottom. Energy policy, here you'll see really how little I have managed to understand energy policy, but it's very clear to those of us who are coming into this area from the outside, this is a comparatively closed and secretive policy area. If I contrast with what we know about food policy, for example, the World Committee on Food Security has a civil society mechanism, has quite a lot of participation, as well as strong grassroots movements around food security, food sovereignty and hunger. There is nothing comparable really with respect to people's rights to affordable energy. There is no formal space for citizen engagement, and these subsidy reforms frequently provide new opportunities, we call them political opportunity structures, for mass protests to occur. And although we definitely need to do more work on this, our sense from the literature and our limited engagements with multilateral actors is that reform is still treated very much as a technical matter, and the politics of it are really not very sufficiently grasped, I think. But citizen engagement is, we think, from what we've seen, the necessity. There's absolutely no chance of moving forward on just transitions or energy justice without far more significant broad-based citizen engagement. We don't offer this as the answer. This is not at all an easy issue to address, and that it's complicated also by the fact that there are tensions rather than alliances between northern climate change movements and southern demands for affordable energy, which is why you see comparatively little support from northern energy protest movements for if you like energy price protesters or fuel rioters in the global south. We don't think that involving citizens will improve the technical solutions that are being found to energy justice, but there's almost no point, we feel, going ahead without it. I'm going to leave that there now, these key questions.
Naomi, thank you so much. It's a fascinating set of findings. As I said before, the links to the paper, the synthesis paper, which Naomi led and the writing of, is in the chat, so please do have a look at it. To discuss the issues which Naomi's just raised, we asked a wonderful set of panelists to consider three questions. First of all, how might accountability for energy policies to citizens be enhanced? What kinds of models of engagement with citizens on energy policy might be feasible, effective, or desirable? And what should their organizations do differently? As well as to reflect more generally on the challenges raised by the research. Our first panelist is Vivienne Foster. Vivienne Foster is the chief economist for the Infrastructure Vice Presidency of the World Bank, where over the last 20 years, she's been advising governments in more than 30 countries across the developing world. She's produced a huge amount of policy-oriented research over the years, including water, electricity and poor, Africa's infrastructure, building bridges, and most recently, Rethinking Power Sector Reform, which is a really seminal document, which is one of the first World Bank documents really to delve into the political economy of the power sector and take that seriously, as including citizen engagement. And most recently, she is the co-director of the World Development Report 2021 Data for Better Lives. So Vivienne, over to you. You've got 7 minutes. And again, if people have got questions, I encourage you to put them in the Q&A or in the chat as we go along. Vivienne, over to you.
Thanks very much, Neil and Naomi and the organizers for this opportunity. I think this is a very important topic and it's under-researched, as Naomi said. So I'm so glad that you've taken it on. I'd like to make about 4 points in response to the very interesting paper. So first of all, while the research focused on the case studies, and it's obviously very important to look at those in depth, I understand that there's now also a broad database that covers all kinds of energy protests. And I think it would be interesting for an area for additional research to actually try and understand a little bit more the taxonomy of energy protests, because I think they fall into a number of different categories. We've heard mainly about protests around energy prices, and those are certainly frequent and highly visible. But I think I can think of at least 3 other types of protests. One is regarding power outages, so the quality of service, and I think those are also very important. A second is around protests around privatization and other kind of structural reforms related to energy, which we've also seen to be quite, potent in certain environments and have been quite visible. And the third I wanted to mention is the protests that really, in a sense, don't happen, but in a sense ought to happen, which is protests from people who don't have access to electricity at all. And perhaps one of the biggest puzzles is why we don't see more of those kind of protests, but we mainly see protests from people who do have energy and have legitimate grievances of various kinds. So that's the first point. It would be good to have a more comprehensive taxonomy of energy protests. Secondly, the authors were quite, in a way, pessimistic in their conclusions by saying that, you know, the protests didn't really achieve much, and that certainly resonated. And I can see that that's the case in many instances. But it made me think about whether I could think of examples when protesters did achieve quite a bit. And the example that sprung to mind was the riots in Egypt in the summer of 2013-14 around massive power outages, 6 hours a day in the height of summer. There was a very strong government response to these protests. 2,500 megawatts of emergency power was put in place very quickly. A huge amount of new investment was contracted, and the whole gas field, exploration production was accelerated. So to me, those protests really had a really large impact that changed the whole course of the sector. I also think about certain privatization protests, and an example that sprung to mind was the Senegalese privatization, back in the 90s, where the unions, launched a massive strike and really, reshaped the direction of the privatization, as well as, winning certain benefits for themselves in terms of, work security and so on. So that's the second point, really, that I think there may be some instances when protests do catalyze change, and it would be interesting to look at that in your wider sample. The third point is around comparing cases of price reform where there's protest with those where there's no protest. Because while it's true that there are a lot of protests around price hikes, it's not true that every time we have a price hike, there's a big protest. So the question, I think a really interesting question is why? Why is it that in some situations there's a set of circumstances that catapult us into protest, whereas in others, it is possible to navigate the price hike without adverse public reaction. Some of the things that we've learned from working with countries on this is the importance of gradualism, the importance of targeting the hikes to the sort of less vulnerable groups. The need to continue to work on that longer term agenda of safety nets that was mentioned, and also simultaneous improvements in quality of service. It's easier to raise a price if people are getting a decent service than if they're getting, next to nothing. But also process issues around communication campaigns, consultation, and generally having a clear narrative about why the hikes are needed and what will be the resulting benefits from them. So I think, again, Egypt is interesting in that regard because following the riots around the shortages, there was a sustained, a series of price hikes over time. And those did not lead to major reactions in the way that the shortages did. I think India's LPG subsidy reform is another very interesting, experience of a smart design of a subsidy removal that did not generate major adverse reactions. So I think be interesting to look at the two side by side. And finally, regarding the channels for civil society participation, I think it's fair to say that, at least in theory, the idea is that the regulatory process, if it's properly designed, should create space for public consultation and civil society engagement. When we surveyed regulatory governance around, several developing countries, we found that, quite a high percentage, maybe about a half, at least on paper, incorporate mechanisms for public consultation around regulatory decisions like tariffs. Now, how well that's working in practice, I think, is an open question. And I think it would be interesting to actually go and look at what the practice of this is like. But at least on paper and at least in theory, the regulatory process is a channel that should be used to have this kind of engagement with the public. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much and look forward to the discussion.
Wonderfully succinct. Thank you so much, Vivian. A very, very helpful perspective, particularly coming from one of the leading institutions working on energy policy around the world. But of course, the World Bank has to work with somebody, and it works with governments around the world. And so we're delighted to have a representative here who understands all about government. Waqas bin Najib is the energy member of the Planning Commission of Pakistan. Prior to taking up this role, he was in the public sector. Waqas was part of a distribution leadership team heading the technology and innovation division at KE. That's K Electric, which is Pakistan's first and to date only private sector integrated electricity distribution company. So he really understands the mechanics of actually getting power to people. Waqas led the digitization and automation of business processes, and there's about 20 years experience in the energy sector, all told. So Waqas, over to you, 7 minutes from you, from both a private and a public perspective on the issue of engaging citizens.
Thank you very much. I think first of all, congratulations to the authors in arranging a wonderful session. And thank you, Naomi, for the presentation. I think Vivian's comments were very, very, they were superb, they were very targeted, and I generally sort of tend to agree with how she framed the issues. I think the first thing about understanding the protests, it's very important because what Vivian calls taxonomy, it's the difference between constituencies of energy are quite stark. So within urban setting, you've got quite a set of different constituencies that exist. Their dependence on energy or electricity is different, and so is their reaction to either availability or pricing. And the rural setting is entirely different. So for instance, in Pakistan, the rural discontent with energy generally comes from agricultural activities or tube well related subsidies or access, not very much related to the residential quality of supply or other activities because of low dependence on energy or lower energy intensity of activity. Unlike the urban setting where access becomes primary, and as you've noted in your paper, and as Vivian said, similar to Egypt, the shortages are very easy to projectize for the governments. So if there is a known shortage of, let's say, 2,000 megawatts, it's very easy for the government to immediately turn around and projectize it into a few generation projects. So I think mostly the protests around shortages of supply would be generally effective, I would imagine, across the world. But most of the other issues are much more than bridging the supply gap. And that's where the real I think, analysis is required. The lag between political decisions and their impacts in the energy sector is much longer than the political life of many political actors and many activists which are there. So because of that lag, there's also lack of interest because it's most of the energy policy issues are become more abstract. And so I'll give you the example of energy tariff setting in Pakistan. So Pakistan set up a regulator around 20 years ago. And they made processes, at least on paper, which are very transparent, and they publish everything on the website. They hold multiple public consultative sessions in various cities. But the level of since I worked for a utility, the level of participation of citizens is always very low. And the way the issues are framed, the way the working papers are made, they are very difficult to understand, even for the experts who are not part of that process full time, which creates a lot of information barriers and understanding barriers. So, and so I think apart from energy supply, which I think is easy to bridge and where the protests work very, very well, this pricing and affordability is where the protests often happen. They happen when a set of circumstances meet, but very little can be done to address the demands of those protesters. So generally, because the gestation period of decision is much longer. I think there's also different, there's another aspect of policy, and that is that the shortages, so bridging shortages for urban rich is a very high cost on the system. So the last 10-20% of demand in most of the countries is very expensive to meet. So most of the shortages protests are generally representing higher middle class urban constituencies. And to meet those protests, the cost, the burden on pricing would be much heavier and often disproportionate. And I think that's a very interesting aspect to research in my view, that and many of these urban residential demands are related to climate often. So in Pakistan, it would be the peak summer when the air conditioning won't work, and the space cooling won't work. So there'll be more tendency of protest if there is lack of supply. And generally, because that's the main political constituency, in order to address those shortage needs, the type of decisions that the government will make will have very, very high cost generally. And that happened in Pakistan. So 5 5 to 7 years ago, there was shortages around 5,000 megawatt of supply demand gap. Then the government went into an emergency mode and set up large power plants. But because they were set up at a very short notice, the cost of that electricity is really, really high. And those contracts are long-term. So we are stuck with very long-term high pricing of electricity, which is often there to meet the peak demand. So I think that relationship between meeting the peak demand and pricing is also very interesting to study. I think one of the ways, and I'll just give a quick comment on price increase from the government side. I think the phasing approach that Vivian talked about and targeting of price increase works fairly well. And I think in Pakistan in the past 2-3 years, we've seen quite a lot of price increase, but since it was very, very phased, it was generally targeted to, and the low-income groups were sort of protected in that price increase, so there was less noise. But as it builds up, there will be a certain point when people will start realizing that this has become really unaffordable, and we may see some progress in future as this price increase keeps going. I think one of the ways to have more participation is having more clear frameworks or very clear narratives of discussion around energy policy. And since we're short in time, I'll just give one example from Pakistan, because that's most relevant for me, and I know it firsthand, is the sort of energy planning model that Pakistan developed. So Pakistan is a federation of federating units, and so apart from citizens, there was also this federating units which were competing for resources. So in Pakistan, what we did was that in the past 3 years, we shifted to a long-term planning model. So there is an actually computer model with dispatch simulations that will now decide the generation plants based on least cost principle and, within the constraints of what government objectives and policies. I think that's one of the ways of making it more transparent, and that model is in excess of policymakers, different citizens, and I think people will just dive into those sort of modeling activities, and they may be better informed. So that takes away the power of ad hoc decision making from the government, which was always there to immediately respond to supply demand gaps. And since we are in a supply surplus capacity because of those actions, I think there is room for countries like Pakistan to embark on something with a long-term integrated planning approach, which is a very interesting window of opportunity for countries like that. But it only happened because we overinvested on generation, and now we've got 2-3 years of window so there's no capacity or no supply protests happening on the streets. So there is a window to do some actual reform work. So I think we are very excited in at least the energy policy circles to be able to get some space of doing some reform work. But in the end, my 7 minutes are over. So in the end, I'd say that most of the countries from global south, which are import dependent for their energy supplies, they will always have to choose between affordability and universal access or reliability of supply. So they will not come hand in hand, because the energy poverty, so for instance, even in South Africa with 100% energy access, the energy poverty is probably above 50%. And it's even worse in Pakistan, even for the areas where we have access. So until the average income increases and the electricity or energy bills are reasonable within those income brackets, we will have these points of fissures where protest or unhappiness can erupt. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. Very interesting. And I love the fact that you're raising this issue of high costs as a consequence of sudden splurges of supply. And this is something which many citizens will complain about, is that it's not that the tariff is too low, that the costs are too high, and the costs are too high because of potential corruption within the procurement process. To help us understand the citizen perspective better, our next panelist is Yemi Adamolekun, Yemi is the executive director of Enough is Enough in Nigeria, which is a non-partisan network of individuals and organizations committed to building a culture of good governance and public accountability in Nigeria through active citizenship. EIE has led various advocacy campaigns, including on elections and on the National Assembly. And to mark its 5th anniversary, it started the Office of the Citizen campaign, which if you haven't visited, I recommend you go and visit in Lagos. But the Office of the Citizen campaign, which is focused on teaching citizens their rights and responsibilities as they occupy the highest office in the land. So Yemi, 7 minutes, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Vivian and Waqas. It was very hard to hear you a bit, but I would, because I incorporated some of what Vivian said in my notes already, so we'll see how that goes. So thank you very much. I think one of the first things I'd like to say is that it was when I got invited to this that I ever thought about fuel subsidy protests as energy policy. I just never framed it using that word. I'm sure I've read articles, but it just sort of hit me differently for the very first time. And just as we started and Naomi was presenting, we had a power cut. So my generator is humming very nicely in the background. But I think what's really important in terms of the paper, and thank you very much, interesting findings, is number one, the fact of these protests as political, not about energy, especially in Nigeria, very much political. And the 2012 protest that you highlighted has been the most, I guess, long, most impactful numbers and all of that, was built on a political context. 2011, the then president had been re-elected as president after his predecessor had died in office. So, and there was quite a bit of rumbling, the fact that how he came into power. And so in the fall of 2011, when there was some talk that prices will be increased, we actually reached out to the then Minister of Finance, who is now the Director General of WTO, to request for a meeting as EIE and citizens and young Nigerians, really, just to have a conversation around how was this going to happen? Why is, and the context for us at that time was, why are citizens being penalized by what you have already admitted is a fraudulent system? So why should that be the brunt of citizens instead of prosecuting those who you know are milking the system? The meeting never happened because on January 1st, 2012 was when the fuel price was hiked. And what was also interesting about it is that the paper talks about the role of labor. So Nigeria's song and dance with price increases. The government announces, labor starts a protest, government increases a little bit, not back to the original price, but just a little bit to get everybody off the streets, and kumbaya, everybody's happy. But no, we're not happy, but we move forward. But for 2012, it wasn't started by labor, it was just started by citizens who triggered events. 2011 elections, this was January 2012, just got on the street. So labor jumped on citizens' anger, in a sense. But unfortunately, as also noted in the paper, the way this thing works is that labor, as I like to call them, they're kind of an arm of government because they're a legal entity that government recognizes. So when it's time to negotiate, it's labor that gets called into the room. And unfortunately, 2012 to 2021, it'll be 10 years next year, we haven't deepened that need to organize. And it's not just about energy policy, it's about elections, it's about water, wash, anything you want to name. As citizens, and we haven't deepened that capacity to organize and educate citizens on how to organize around issues, educate appropriately so that you can take action. And it's really not far-fetched, I think, with that within our context. We are in a democracy, but we're not taught the tenets of a democracy. It's not taught in any school. It's not part of our education curriculum in any formalized way. So most Nigerians, and younger ones might have maybe post-1999, which is our longest stint with a democracy, might have a slightly different perspective, but people my age and older tend to think of government in a very different way. And as I say, our military background, culture as a deference to power, and religion, which kind of numbs your mind, doesn't help for people to engage government in a very productive way. So for Nigeria also particularly, the notion around fuel subsidy is because we have oil. So there's an entitlement to this thing, like, why am I paying ridiculously amount for it when it comes from under our ground and we're selling it to the world? So therefore, we should get a benefit from the fact that we have it. Needless to say, that's within a context of social services that are non-functional. So it then becomes a challenge because you have citizens who see this as a benefit against a government that really doesn't particularly care to provide social services. So you can't have an honest conversation. I think one of the things that I was reading was trying to find how I wrote it there. Yes, that government not unwilling to solve corruption. So you recognize there's corruption, but you're unwilling to solve that problem. And it's always about fuel subsidy and removing subsidies. So that continues to be a challenge. The issue around protests being effective. Yes, there is a desperation around protests because you feel that it is in shouting, and I used shouting for protests, that's when you will be heard. It is in causing public havoc, chaos, a disturbance is something that forces political power to pay attention, especially in cities like Lagos and Abuja, political capital, commercial capital, where you literally can cause havoc in traffic and whatever else you want to call by getting people out on the streets. But what has happened over the last 10 years, as you've said, is that even though there's a power in it, and we've seen it from elections to recently when electronic transmission of results was going to be an issue, the outcry from citizens, there wasn't physical protest, but there was a verbal outcry that the National Assembly had to respond to, that protests are still seen as a veritable means of getting government to pay attention, because the other ways of engaging government, and lastly, using your vote as a way of getting attention, hasn't been embedded enough as options and tools that we have in an arsenal as citizens to use. In the last month, I guess, we now have a Petroleum Industry Act. I haven't read the act, we're not familiar with it in detail. So it'll be interesting to see how the implementation of that changes how Nigeria's oil sector works. What is also interesting is that part of the act says that our government agency that manages our oil sector will be privatized. The board was set up, I believe, and announced yesterday, and the chairman of the board is a very interesting character, is what I would say. And lastly, Vivian's point around privatization, which I think is extremely important, especially since Nigeria's power sector was privatized a number of years ago. But I believe, if I'm not mistaken, 40% of it is owned by the federal government. And when the federal government was asking when the distribution companies, as they're called, discos as they're called, for an audit in their finances, they refused. So it's a very interesting relationship as well, where you have a private sector player that is also not playing, in a sense, by the rules of the game. So yeah, I think it was a really interesting paper, very interesting. And the points that I will land on that I agree on is that we have not pivoted protest into sort of a more sustainable, powerful way of articulating voice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yemi. And I think you're absolutely right in your conclusion that there's still a long way to go in pivoting that. Our final panelist has got a lot to say about global civil society. Peter Newell is Professor of International Relations at the University of Sussex and is Research Director of the Rapid Transition Alliance. He's a specialist in politics and political economy of environment and development, and has been working in this field for more than 25 years. And he's also the author of a new book, Power Shift, the Global Political Economy of Energy Transitions, which I can recommend to you all. He managed to get that plug into his bio. So Peter, over to you, 7 minutes.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Neil, and thanks to Naomi for the excellent overview. And really congratulations to all of you on producing this timely and important work. I mean, as stated in the paper, there's a great quote in there that without understanding this why people protest around energy, there's no chance of designing lasting reforms that will move societies either towards fair energy transitions or, of course, towards climate justice. And I was pleased to get this invite from John, actually, in the first instance, to participate in this roundtable, because it allowed me to connect work I was doing with him and Alex Shankland and others involved in this project nearly 20 years ago on citizenship, participation and accountability, with work I've been doing more over the last 10 years or so on energy and energy transitions. And of course, they're both about power, either in its literal electrical sense or in its more social sense, which is a bit more perhaps what we're talking about today. And I think we've already seen how energy is so closely related to security and trade and growth. And for those very reasons, because it's just a core state strategic concern, it's often protected or insulated from more deeper forms of democratic scrutiny and engagement. So it's always high politics. And I think, as Naomi described, it's often also opaque, elitist, technocratic, often very centralized, which makes it really, really hard to open up, because for most citizens at the same time, it's intrinsic to everyday life, right? It's a key part of the social contract between states and citizens. And when the state is failing to deliver on that, as we've seen in many of the examples in the paper, people get uneasy, social unrest often follows, protests, sometimes violence. So Newell asked me to focus in on a couple of things. One was around this question of accountability for energy policies to citizens. And the second thing was to think a little bit about just transitions globally and potentially also the role of international organizations in supporting or facilitating those. So firstly, on accountability, I guess for me, the best, the most important, the most valuable, but also the most difficult form of accountability is almost the pre-accountability. So rather than the ex post kind, it's about having people involved in the design of energy policy pathways in the first place, rather than just be passive recipients of elite choices around energy futures. So in other words, how can we preempt and avoid some of the unnecessary contestation, violence, etc., the negative social impacts, as well as the imposition of controversial policy changes and energy infrastructures. And of course, there's real challenges in moving beyond the sort of temporary policy responses, things that are described in the paper, these temporary crisis management measures, if you like, towards more institutionalized and embedded mechanisms of ongoing engagement, and how to deal with the more informal, unruly politics that are often associated with energy in many parts of the world. And of course, there's a cost to non-engagement, and I think governments realise this. The area I work on most at the moment, energy transitions, there's a lot of work on social acceptance, and that unless you have that buy-in and the support and the ownership and people perceive the benefits of energy alternatives, then you will encounter that resistance and frustration and backlash and all the rest of it. So there's actually a political and a financial cost to not doing these things. But it's not just about, I think, procedure in terms of doing policy better, being more inclusive and transparent. It's also about thinking through and anticipating the distribution, the very uneven distribution in many cases of costs and benefits of different energy pathways. Because, you know, from other work I've done, not in the context in which we're talking about today, but when people can capture some of the benefits from you know, being involved in local energy projects, whether it's wind farms or, you know, community energy projects of one sort or another, then there's often more buy-in, more acceptance, and, you know, less resort to process. But just to sort of bring this into a more global context, these aren't just issues, of course, for the sorts of countries we're talking about at the moment, in the context where there's more fragile states, you know, greater occurrence of violence. I'm currently doing some work with the UK government, with BEIS, and they're really struggling with this too. You know, how do you anticipate and think through potential social impacts on different parts of society? So although the approach in this project is about seeing like a citizen, if you think for a moment like a policymaker, a bit as some of our other colleagues were earlier, is how do you try and anticipate and see in advance where the flashpoints are going to be and where the potential social exclusions might be. And of course, there's a role for consultations here. Lots of governments use intermediary groups. They can't constantly bring people into the process. They often do it indirectly through groups that are tapped into particularly marginalized groups. They'll have advisors, resource people. There's reporting of you know, the impacts of measures on the ground, lesson learning from other contexts. And I like what Vivian said about a taxonomy of what has worked, and when protests and other forms of engagement have been successful is also really useful. And we're seeing other attempts to try and bring people in different ways. Where I'm sat right now in the UK, we've had a climate assembly. There's been attempts to do similar sorts of things in France to try and involve people in controversial decisions about future energy pathways at the very outset to try and avoid some of these problems. But of course, we can't have, it's not realistic to have endless ongoing citizen participation on every aspect of energy policy. It's resource, it's time intensive to some extent because of climate change. We're up against the clock. And maybe it's not always necessary if we're just talking about, you know, I'm talking more in a northern context now, but if you talk about retrofit of buildings or measures to tackle energy poverty, you might not need to consult about those sorts of things. They shouldn't be that contentious. There should be, well, you would imagine there's a big base of public support for those sorts of measures. So we need to think a little bit about where are the areas where we really need citizen engagement and participation, where are there areas where it may be a little bit less necessary. What I do think we need, though, and this again reminds me of the work we did in the DRC on accountability many years ago, is the two elements of accountability. There's the answerability and the enforceability, and you need both. So it's not just about an abstract commitment to listen, to engage, to revise policy in light of feedback and consultation, but it's also about what are the consequences of when that accountability isn't there, or whether there's a failure to deliver. And I think those sorts of things are things we need to think about a bit more carefully. So just on the second point that Neil asked me to touch on, how does this fit within sort of global transitions, and what's the role of international institutions? This is obviously a massive question. What I would say, I think some of the discussions around just transitions are often less about North and South and more actually about rich and poor, because it brings up a whole range of racial, gender and other dimensions about responsibility and agency and uneven exposure to the impact of energy economies, and work on, at Sussex and IDS, of course, as well, on energy justice, climate justice, shows this very clearly. Richer countries in the global north cannot pass on the impacts of their energy policy pathways onto poorer communities in the global south. So whether that's cobalt mining in DRC for the big drive towards electrification, biofuel development, whatever it might be, we need to make sure that it's not richer countries just passing on the costs of these of their transitions to poorer countries and economies. And so a key challenge, I think, for activists and researchers and others is to make sure that that isn't happening, because clearly at the moment, as we approach the big COP summits in Glasgow in November, there's a big drive towards carbon trading, net zero commitments, which potentially produce exactly this dynamic, where rather than reduce emissions at home, we'll pay for carbon savings and emissions reductions elsewhere. And so we need to think very clearly about where the accountability lies for some of those key decisions. And I think, again, pitching it globally, it's really about how do we square the rights and needs of poorer groups to expand their use of energy and accommodated by deeper cuts in demand and production and consumption by the global north. These things are relational. If we have finite global carbon budgets, there's a tension there, and we need fairer mechanisms. And of course, there's lots of proposals out there, from greenhouse development rights frameworks to contraction and convergence, trying to think about what's the global deal that fairly allows poorer groups to expand their use of energy in the ways that they're clearly demanding coming out of this research, but square that with the need to radically decarbonise. And of course, it implies a far bigger responsibility and commitment on the part of richer countries to act first. But this, for me, is where there could be an alignment between movements fighting energy.
Peter, I suspect we may have just lost your connection. Maybe while we're trying to get your connection back.
Sorry?
Pete, we lost you for a second there. Do you want to just quickly wrap up and then we'll move on to Q&A? Is that
okay? Okay, I'll do that. Let me just wrap up very quickly on the role of international organisations. So I think clearly there's far more that can be done. That, we've mentioned the role of the World Bank, IMF, OECD in trying to support fairer fossil fuel phase-out policies. That's clearly an important role to play. Also in redirecting huge amounts of money still going towards fossil fuels and funding the climate crisis, towards supporting energy access in different contexts. I think that's a key thing to be done. And picking up on what Vivian said, I think there's also a role to think about the impacts on different social groups of power sector reforms and the sorts of programs that are being overseen by the World Bank and IMF, etc. But also I'd go further, some of the key investment decisions that are being brokered, some of the trade deals that are being brokered, which have important energy elements, to have much, much fuller transparency around those agreements. And that involves parliamentarians. It's not just about civil society groups or broader categories of citizens. It's also about state officials who are often also excluded from those things. So there's a range of big challenges there I've thrown out, but I'd like to congratulate the team again, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. I appreciate it. And what a fantastic set of contributions from the panelists. So we really do thank you for those. All of you who have been listening patiently for almost an hour now, I'm sure your mind is spinning from all of the various different contributions, but this is now your chance. A few of you have already put in some questions in the Q&A at the bottom or in the chat. Please keep them flowing in. But I wanted to kick off with some questions which were really directed at these issues of protest and popular cultures of protest. So, for example, Joshua Kirshner asked, aren't there differences between popular cultures of protest between countries? For example, Bolivia has a strong history of civic activism, strikes, and protest. And similarly, Bamasaya Olatola said, in many developing countries with grossly insensitive leaderships, protests remain a veritable tool to waking them to their sacred governmental responsibilities to the citizens. Yemi, are there differences in popular cultures of protest between countries? And if so, does this matter?
Yes, I believe there are. And I think a good sort of framing for that would be the Arab Spring. So for a lot of people, when they talk about it, they see it as Facebook. So Facebook started a whole movement. But that's not really the case. I mean, yes, something happened with Facebook, but it met a movement that was already on ground. It met people who were already organized, people who were already having conversations, meetings, connections already. So I think sometimes we maybe glamorize the parts of it that we can see above the parts that we can't see. So the two examples that we're giving, yeah, if you have already a strong, and I guess the thing about it, and we've seen the protests over the last couple of years in different countries. I mean, Hong Kong is a recent example. When there's organization around a singular issue and people are clear about the issues and there's a clarity around the demand. And so that in a sense, who you're also talking to and or engaging or negotiating with, as the case may be, are people that are speaking for the issues, you will have different outcomes. Unlike you would in Nigeria, as the paper clearly states, when citizens are on the street protesting, but then you engage labor and labor is pacified because of what benefits them. And everybody literally goes off the streets because organization outside of labor doesn't exist. So yeah, I do agree.
Thank you very much, Yemi. I wanted to switch to a very interesting question that came in about collectivism. This is from Rosie McGee, I think. She points out that the report comments on the fleeting nature of empowerment that citizens experience, and also that digital activism and reliance of social media have become common, and was wondering whether these two are actually connected. She asks, is it to be expected that an increasingly digitized approach to protest will not empower citizens or generate accountability? Pete, do you want to have a crack at this one?
I think there's probably others that are better qualified, but I can have my full penneth. I mean, I think it can go either way, can't it? You can say that, a bit like in the UK at the moment, where citizens can get a hearing in Parliament if enough people sign a petition. So collectivism has a role in sort of having accountability or forcing a debate. I think it does have an important role in sending clear messages, but I think in other contexts, it may be far more effective. I guess this comes back to Josh's point. You really need to tailor your strategies to the nature of the political system, the types of space you have, what's most likely to work, whether you have other channels available to you. Collectivism is a way of sort of sending a sort of short, sharp signal, but it can also lead to institutional responses. So I guess I'm not wanting to discredit it too much, because that has been an important innovation in the UK, at least, where you can trigger parliamentary action if enough people are willing to sign some of these sort of petitions. But I'll defer to others who probably have more to say on that.
Yeah. Pete, Naomi, do you have views on this?
Of course I do. Thanks, Neil.
Surprise.
Yeah. No, and I also have views on the previous question as well, but I will keep myself brief on that, because I did want to respond to something a very interesting point that Vivian made about avoiding protest, and I think that's important. But on this issue of collectivism and on, if you like, the shift to social media and on the different cultures of protest, I think it's really important to think about the ways in which the space in which you can protest, the kinds of protest that you're likely to put forward, and in political sociology we'd say repertoires of protest, are closely shaped by the politics, closely shaped by what the state lets you do, and closely shaped also by your past histories of organizing. Whenever you study a protest of any kind, you'll find that it's never the first one about this issue or about any other issue. People who are protesting have always done so before about something. There's always a memory, and that shapes what we understand to be effective or not effective in the act of protesting. I think the really interesting point about This is in Mozambique. We saw, the 2010 protests were so dramatic, and they were so unexpected by the Mozambican government that after that, essentially the tanks moved in and have stayed there ever since. There have been no major protests ever since then, despite the food price rises, not because the citizens are very satisfied with how they're being listened to or with the services they're getting, but because people were killed, and because the government is very, very clear that no such repetition of 2010 will be allowed. And so what you see there is this really rich and fascinating flourishing of quite ironic and sarcastic and funny social media posts mocking the corruption of the ruling groups and so on. Do they have any effect? They create a certain sort of public discourse, but it's often quite a cynical public discourse rather than one that will bring people together to demand something better. But this is what there is. I think Rosie's point comes from a question of closing civic space. How do you protest in these situations? And I think that's where the social media comes in a lot. It's a bit safer.
Yeah, thank you, Naomi. Waqas, I wanted to bring a question to you. It's not coming from the chat, but actually is a question which I wanted to raise about the problems of circular debt in Pakistan. As we all know, Pakistan has got a challenging situation, as many countries do, in which customers basically don't pay their utilities in full, who then don't pay the central buyer of electricity in full, who then fail to pay the generators, who then fail to pay the fuel suppliers. And as a result, you end up with a system that is full of debt and not terribly functional. And at the core of the problem is the difficulty of charging a cost-reflective tariff. But as you pointed out earlier, sometimes very rapid investments in these things give rise to very high cost energy, and then people understandably feel that this is a corrupt process and why should they pay these high things? So my question is, how should governments respond when citizens sometimes rightly believe that tariffs are high because of corruption or inefficiency of the key energy elites in the country?
Thank you, Neil. I think in my view, it's one, the circular debt in Pakistan is mostly because of very high cost of generation and not being able to pass that cost to the customers. So non-paying customers, so that loss is generally built in the tariff. So that's not an additional cost. So I think it's mostly very high cost of generation and not being able to transfer that cost to the citizen, to the consumers. Secondly, I think I know of, so I work for a utility. I know and I work for a private utility. So I think we went through a very difficult transition from being a public sector owned utility to a private sector one. But there are very few citizens who default on the payments because of ideas like, they don't want to pay because the government is corrupt. So I think there are two general tendencies. One, there's general lack of rule of law in the country. So I think it's easy to break the law. So theft comes, I think, generally from that tendency that people, so law enforcement is weak. So they just think it's okay to steal. And the second is affordability. So in peak summers, in urban centers, when the temperature gets above 45 degrees Celsius, the quality of life becomes so desperate that I think it's the theft and non-payment increases, because even the poorer households who otherwise cannot afford electricity, they're again forced to use the appliances. So I think circular debt, again, I diagnose it more as a problem of poor investments on the supply side. And on the other hand, it's the not being able to pass the true cost in the tariffs by the political governments because of political instability, because there's generally very little political capital with the governments to take this decision. Having said that, given the average income of the citizens or the general consumer base in Pakistan, it's also actually very difficult, even if there is political will to pass this, because I think then the affordability becomes a question. So I think this is an equation which needs balancing. And for a poorer country, I think it's the supply side which we'll have to give if we want a sustainable system.
Thank you very much, Waqas. Vivian, I know this is something that you've given a lot of thought to as well. Do you want to come in on this point?
Well, I'm not sure specifically on this, but I can build a little bit on some of Waqas's points and contribute to some of the other themes in the conversation. So one of the things that's striking me, Waqas was saying earlier, well, yeah, the regulator does, put out these documents supposedly for public consultation, but they're pretty obscure. And if you think about it, in kind of more high-income countries where there's been perhaps more time for civil society to develop, you have consumer entities that actually quite well resourced and have the skills to really, engage deeply with the material. And I think, it's a long way from kind of the mob on the street to having, a formal consumer body. I think the institution that Yemi represents is a great example of this emerging, in Nigeria. But I think for the citizens to be able to be a kind of credible voice and also a sustained presence, right? Because we're saying this is it's like a flame, it's like a firework, it goes off and there's nothing. We want a sustained kind of interlocutor on the citizen side. Then I think there needs to be a building up of institutions and capacity in civil society to take on that role. And in many societies in the global south, we're just not there yet. We're at a very, very early stage. And I think that's missing. And that means the whole system is out of balance in terms of the citizens' viewpoints being heard. The other point I wanted to pick up from Waqas was also, that the citizens are not necessarily, one body with common interests, right? As he pointed out, the high-income urban dwellers may actually have an interest in pushing for overinvestment so that they don't have to suffer occasional power cuts, which may then make the service unaffordable for the vast majority. So even among the citizenry, I don't think we can think of them as a homogeneous group with, consistent or common interest necessarily. It's more complicated than that. So there's just a couple of thoughts on the conversation evolving.
Brilliant. Thank you, Vivian. Yemi, you wanted to come in on this point, and then there's also a question in the Q&A for you as well. Yemi.
All right. No, just wanted to talk about, like, when we talk about protests, we tend to think street protests, and I think Vivian made the point. So in Nigeria, I mean, the two interesting ones is those pushing for secession in the southeastern part of the country have been using stay-at-home protest as a way to sort of make their point against the government. And the US examples from the Montgomery Boys boycotts, economic protest to Black Lives Matter, where that was used or tried to be used, or brands were moved so that it would not be used, so that they aligned their voice with the Black Lives Matter protest. So just wanted to throw that in there. And then collectivism, and I loved Peter's point about the sort of variety of what it can do. The Twitter ban in Nigeria is a classic example of that. So Twitter had become such a powerful voice, and at least in my reckoning, the government saw it as a tool for mobilization at the back of the NSAS movement. So Facebook did exactly the same thing Twitter did in taking down the president's post, but Facebook wasn't banned, Twitter was, because Twitter is a lot more political in its use. It's a lot, and because it's not as diffused as Facebook would be, it's very concentrated in its criticism of government. So banning Twitter as one social media platform was a very clear sign of the power that collectivism does have, or social media platforms do have for organizing.
Thanks very much, Yemi. Onyekachi Onyewa, you've been waiting very patiently and you had your hand up. What's your question and who's it for?
All right, thank you very much. I wanted to add to Yemi's voice relative to the narrative in Nigeria. So for us over a while, we have noticed this the ban to Twitter, just like she mentioned. So there has been a deliberate effort to see that not just the civil society space is shrinking, but citizens are not able to hold their government to account. So at different platforms, it's evident. She just mentioned agitations for secession, which is basically in Southeast. So we observe that in the midst of terrorism, which we merely call banditry over here, the government doesn't come out bringing out its full arsenal to, tackle the situation. But once citizens start having agitations over bad leadership and things around it, you see the military force comes out, the police and all of that. In recent time, we had the NSAS protest. It was really, really huge. People were protesting against the police force, the brutality that comes with it and all of that, and not applying our judicial rules around the Administration of Criminal Justice Act, as well as the Penal Act for police, dealing with citizens the way they deem fit, which is unconstitutional. But it degenerated to not just having people protested against that. People were angry about the bad leadership we have experienced over the years. And you also mentioned the recent passage of the Petroleum Industry Act. Now that bill has been in the National Assembly for what seemed to be up to 20 years. And for us, we felt as civil society organizations, this act should be passed into law to help improve regulations in the extractive sector. So if you must know, the petroleum...
Possible for you to focus on a question to ask one of the panelists. I'm conscious that we've got limited time and we want to get in a few more questions. Do you have a specific question you want to ask?
Okay, let me frame it this way. Now, in view of the fact that when we have a major crisis in our hands, because there has been lots of kidnapping of school children, especially in the northern part of Nigeria, and then when citizens, for example, want to agitate, okay, in different forms, you see a clampdown, just like the banning of Twitter. So what measures do we think citizens can also use better to engage the government to ensure that we have better outcomes as against having citizens' voices being shouted down upon, closing up social media platforms, and bringing policies and laws in the National Assembly to ensure that citizens do not...
That's a really good question, Nyakachi. Yemi, a quick response on this issue? You're on mute, Yemi.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understood the question, Nyakachi. Could you reframe it just really succinctly? What was the question?
So Yemi, you understand the scenario very well in Nigeria. You've been working in Nigerian environments. I'm saying that we have issues of terrorism, and then government has not put in as much effort as we all anticipate to address these issues. But when there are issues of, when people are angry about the kind of leadership and things surrounding it, and start making agitation, then we bring out our military force and all power to make sure we clamp them down. So we are looking at, having other viable approaches to ensure that citizens' voices are not clamped down on. What other approaches do you suggest? Because the last events, you know how it ended.
I understand. Thank you. I got it. Well, it's not, and I think let's also be very clear about NSAS and the context that NSAS provides. NSAS wasn't planned. NSAS was a protest that was very organic. People thought a young man was killed in Delta State by SARS operatives, and that triggered, and because SARS had a history, just as Naomi rightly said, protests are not the first time people are agitating about an issue. People started protesting about a particular issue, but then it expanded to bad governance, But the point about the matter, which we still have, is the fact that we're not organizing as much as we should. And I think Vivian made the point very clearly. In the global north, I would say, the resources to engage on these issues where people can actually have conversations within a context where you understand the dynamics of power. I am not confident. Most Nigerians do not understand the dynamics of power in a democracy. We cede power to those in political authority consistently. So because of that, there is no threat to them of their hold on power, because those of us who, in a sense, they serve don't understand that. So I think on one hand, the alternative is that we need to do the work. We need to do the work to educate people on the dynamics of power, so that when you engage politicians or when these issues are on the table, there's a clarity about who is in charge. And we don't have that. And we need to recognize that, not that it's not anybody's fault. The system is designed that way for a reason. The more people you have who don't know the powers that they have, the less they can hold officers accountable.
Yemi. We're running out of time, but I'm keen to get one final question in before we move to our listener. We've been very fortunate to have a listener, Matt Carter, who's been listening to this, and I'm going to give him a chance to reflect on the various things that he's heard in a minute. But before we do that, I wanted to ask Pete the final question from Ned Hoyt. Ned raises a really interesting challenge of gradualism versus radical action. He points out that, as Vivian was suggesting, gradualism is a key part of effective reform, but in the face of accelerating impacts of climate change, we need to move very rapidly. Are we not heading in the direction of a train wreck if we insist on greater participation in deliberation and gradualism in reform processes when the challenges to system resilience accelerate with greater likelihood of disruptions that trigger protests? Pete, gradualism or radical action?
Well, there's a role for both. But of course, yeah, this always comes up now. Like, it's about how do you square the equity and the urgency thing. Everyone's talking about more deliberation, more participation around these sorts of things. And I mentioned assemblies and so on, but at the same time, there's an element of urgency, right? And how to speed these things up. I guess my sense is this scope for participation and deliberation around pathways, choices, moving forward and thinking about where we want to get to. But we can't use what I sometimes find in debates about just transitions. It's often used by incumbents as an excuse to slow down action. In other words, until we've thought about all potential negative social impacts, until we've thought about full compensation and retraining programs for any area that might be affected by a coal wind down, for example, we cannot act. And so it's often used actually as a strategy by incumbents to deliberately slow things down. So I think there are certain things that can be done quite quickly, clearly need to be done quite quickly, but it can be things like leaving certain supplies of fossil fuels in the ground, for example, I would say. So there are certain things that can be done quickly, but there are certain things where you need fuller deliberation, engagement, if you're going to get the sort of ownership and avoid the sort of negative reactions that we've been talking about today.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Pete. So as I mentioned, we're very fortunate that Matt Carter from FCDO has been very kindly listening in the background, and he's agreed to give us 5 minutes of reflections. Matt is the head of the Rule of Law and Justice and Human Rights and Rule of Law Department of FCDO. He's worked across Africa and the Middle East and has a particular focus on public sector governance, which is what we're talking about often, and institutional reform issues. Matt, what have you heard that you found interesting, fascinating, or challenging? And what does it mean also for what FCDO should be doing in the world?
Yes, thank you, Neil, and great questions. And I've been scribbling away whilst listening to all of the speakers and the excellent questions. I'll just start by echoing thanks to the authors for what clearly is really important research. And I was sort of reflecting as I was scribbling away that the way in which the presentation and the paper, as I read last night, presents a very sobering picture about both the sort of the scale of the challenge and the way in which protest manifests itself in sort of improved accountability and really throwing into stark relief the challenges that have faced policymakers and development practitioners. And I was also struck by the fact that this was one of the first papers and discussions that I've joined in the last 18 months that doesn't lead with COVID and the pandemic, but it is implicit, I think, in the background and the unprecedented pressures that are going to be facing governments in terms of public finance, social welfare provision, but also more widely sort of crises in democratic governance. And I might say something about that in different time. But I think after the discussion, I have to confess, I found myself feeling slightly more, maybe cautiously optimistic about the prospects for improved accountability, looking at the energy sector in particular. And then also the sense that there may be some actionable propositions for policymakers like myself and my colleagues in the FCDO that are sort of starting to sort of germinate in this discussion. Let me just turn to some of the key takeaways and themes and reflections. I think the first thing that really came through was the need for us to take a more sophisticated approach in the way we think about energy protests. So if I reflect on this in the context of the FCDO, you have economists who generally see protests as an obstacle or a risk that has to be overcome in order to get to an optimal solution. And then governance advisors like myself, who see it as an opportunity to seize and to open up institutions and decision making. And I was just reflecting and sort of zooming out a little bit there and thinking at this most simplistic level, each lens really does miss something. And that's where I feel like Naomi's research and the work that we're doing seeks to join up these perspectives and to sort of have these two communities and these two perspectives talk to each other. I think second, something that really came through very clearly was that our analysis really needs to be underpinned by the taxonomies, I think was the phrase that Vivian used. And so Vivian started by talking about the taxonomies of reform, which might result in or might have differential impacts, thinking about not just price rises, which might be particular and singular, but also the changes to the way that that the energy sector is organised through privatisation and availability. But then I think Waqas sort of really brought in the sort of the sense in which we need a taxonomy of protest as well, or the protesters, and that they're not a homogenous group, and that sort of, I think he masterfully sort of set out the ways in which sort of urban and rural constituencies, middle and class and poorer labourers and farmers will engage, and their interests are served by engaging in some of these protests. And that perhaps we need to, as governance, as advisors and as development practitioners, we need to reflect these protests. The way these protests are constituted might be as important, if not more important, than the fact that they are happening at all. I just turned to the third was I was just really struck by Yemi's account from Nigeria, but also something Vivian said about the role of intermediary organisations and institutions and the fleeting nature of popular protests, whether embedded in a culture or not. And the examples that came from Nigeria, but also I think I scribbled down somewhere here Senegal, and the role that Labour has played in sort of bringing some of these grievances, and the voice, and organising it in a way that it can actually support a bargaining process between citizens and the state. And I think that for me is really vital. It's that at the end of the day, sort of contestation that sort of doesn't lead to bargaining, can be and I think this comes through in the paper, can lead to greater disruption. And I think that we as policymakers we focus a lot on supporting the state through technical assistance, supporting civil society, but the role of those intermediary institutions, and the fact that through a lot of these protests, those institutions and organizations that have succeeded have brought together identities and the formation of particular identities. Labour in terms of trade unions, women in gender and maybe ethnic and regional groups, and that therefore sort of our ability to sort of think about the way in which energy protests might actually help constitute new identities or build bridges between identities and organizations, I think is really important. I think fourth, I sort of scroll down here some notes about accountability for what is my question. So sorry, I'm just aware of time. And the complex, abstract, and sort of fairly opaque nature, even for those who are steeped in the theology of energy reform, means that sort of we can be perhaps a little too pat about talking about energy reform. And I think about accountability in the energy sector. And I thought Peter covered this well, thinking about pre-accountability rather than post, and involvement in design. I think in a lot of our work we tend to think about accountability in terms of or overcoming the protest as an obstacle through better communication, phased and gradual design. I think that did come through, but actually that sort of again excludes the role of bargaining and actual compromise between groups. And I suppose then my final point is the one that Peter really ended on, which is the sort of sometimes slow and grinding nature of some of these processes, social and economic processes, that sort of confront still the scale of the challenge. And then maybe accountability, it's an important reflection, but it's not the sum total, and that we need to be thinking about the extent to which policymakers can respond to that scale and the immediacy of the challenge. And I know that from the SCDO, that is on our minds as we approach COP26, and that there will be decisions that sometimes need to be made, and policies and reforms, and how we can sort of reconcile that with the need to also confront the crises in democratic governance space with the local community. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Neil.
Matt, thank you very much for a wonderful set of comments and reflections, and we really appreciate you listening in and giving us that feedback. So what we're going to do now is we're going to give each of the panelists 1 minute, quick reflections of what they've heard and what they will take away from today's discussion. And then I'm going to let us finish off as we started with 1 minute from Naomi about her reflections and thoughts. So starting with Vivian again, over to you.
Thanks, Neil. So I think what I take away is that this
Vivian,
is
we're struggling to see you. I don't know if there's a light that can be put on.
I wish I could do something about it. It's completely beyond my control, but it seems to alternate between light and dark. So hopefully,
Right, not to worry.
So what I take away from this is an important area of research, and I think it sets an agenda for more, exploration of this important topic. We've talked about looking at not just going deep, but also looking broader at the whole kind of population of protests and understanding them, more systematically the differences between them. We've talked about taxonomies. We've talked about comparing situations where protests happen to situations where they don't happen and trying to understand why. And I think we've talked a lot about the intermediation of citizen demands and the need for there to be sort of intermediary institutions that have some degree of capacity to engage in a sustained dialogue. So I take these all away as possible areas of further research. Thank you.
Fantastic, wonderfully succinct. Waqas.
Thank you very much. I think it was a wonderful session, and there was a lot to learn. I think the very paper was an opportunity to look at this issue in a different light and from a different perspective, and I think that was very, very instructive. One point that I think I'd like to leave the audience with is that as in most of the developing countries, the power sector is moving towards some sort of privatization and corporatization of state-owned entities. I think the role of regulatory process becomes really, really important. And so does the need for having intermediaries and interlocutors for the citizens in the regulatory process, which will become increasingly complex as we go along. So I think need for these civil society institutions to really establish platforms for civil society experts, and continuous engagement in these issues would be critical to have citizens' voice in this regulatory process as the privatization increases and the role of government becomes less direct in the energy sector, both power and natural gas sector. So I think that's a very important takeaway where we can all focus in the coming years.
Thank you very much, Waqas. Very interesting to see you echoing what Vivian was saying there about the importance of intermediary organizations. Yemi, what are your final thoughts?
Thank you. I really like Vivian's point about why are there protests and why are there not. I think that's make a very interesting read as a paper. But lastly, just really a commitment for myself and the organization that I lead to make energy policy a part of our election conversations in 2023. It's never been, as far as I know. We talk about fuel subsidy off and on, but to frame it as energy policy and have a really holistic conversation around that with those who seek to be president will be very interesting, and I look forward to that.
That's brilliant, and we look forward to the 2023 coverage of the election. And Pete, some final thoughts from you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I guess for me, what's coming through is obviously the need to improve accountability mechanisms, but more fundamentally to sort of shift the power or hold power to account more fundamentally, because what I keep hearing is that the power of incumbents to resist change, right? The beneficiaries of a non-functioning, dysfunctional energy system, whether it's in terms of service delivery or its lack of sustainability or whatever it means. And yet the gains that those actors make from an enduring, albeit dysfunctional system. And it strikes me then the only way to sort of disrupt that and shift it will be things around, stopping the revolving doors, the corruption, the
We've lost you, I think. Peter, are you with us still?
Key to disrupt that.
Peter, we lost you when you said stopping the corruption and the revolving doors.
Right. So basically, I was saying the key to sort of this power shift I'm describing is precisely the sorts of protests. Although we've talked about protest as a bad thing here in a way, and a sort of sign that things are not functioning, it can also be a very key, effective thing at sort of driving the sorts of changes that I think are ultimately necessary.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And that's a sentiment I know Naomi will agree with. Naomi, final word over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. This is really incredibly interesting. And I feel we're just beginning to talk at these issues from the very different perspectives that we come from. And just wanted to say one point about protests. I think this has come up a lot, is how do we know what is the difference between a setting in which a protest happens and doesn't? And I think the absence of protest should not be taken as evidence of the satisfaction of the citizens with the policy. It is actually quite hard to organize a protest, particularly if you think the government is going to send the tanks and the riot police down, or you won't be able to go to work that day. Or as we found in Nigeria, your parents have locked the door and said, no, you cannot go. But people go. People go only sometimes when the conditions are right. So I think we shouldn't take the evidence, we shouldn't take it, the policy passes and nobody takes the street as evidence that everything is hunky-dory, everything is not necessarily good. I think that's really important. I wanted to say, I thought it's really important also to think about the ways in which we can act on these issues. And, another part of my work recently has been looking at World Bank citizen engagement grievance redress mechanisms. And there, I think, to some extent, some responsibility can be handed back to Vivian and her team for the, the massive investments and the other larger lending programs that are now required, in fact, to have substantial and meaningful citizen engagement mechanisms. It's not the World Bank's job to hold the government accountable for citizens, but the World Bank has means and mechanisms at its hand to involve citizens more in these conversations. I think this is a very early, we're just barely touching the surface here of this, but I'm really grateful to you all for bringing your expertise and positions and all of that to this. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Naomi. And let me just echo my thanks to both you and all of the panelists for your excellent contributions, and to all the participants for really great questions and a good discussion. As Naomi says, this is only the beginning of a conversation that is going to run and run. Please do click on the links and have a look at the papers, both the synthesis paper and the individual papers for Nigeria and Mozambique, I believe, are available. I think the Pakistan one is as well. So thank you all for joining, and have a lovely morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you.